This is obviously the NASA logo and our patch that was designed by the crew. This is in the suit-up room, and we suit up on the, about 3.5 hours prior to launch. Tracy looking composed for a first-time flyer. Here's Rick getting his suit on. Dave Williams, pretty relaxed. Barb Morgan. And last but not least, Al Drew, who was added to our mission somewhat late. We launched from pad 39A. Here's our walkout. I don't think we actually walked this fast. I think they sped it up so they could get the whole walkout scene in the video. It's much harder to walk in those suits than it might appear. This is a view of the middeck getting strapped in. You're actually in the flight deck. You're actually in the vehicle on your back for a pretty long time, and you're strapped in pretty tightly into the seats. So it can be somewhat uncomfortable, actually, and we're in the shuttle for about almost 3 hours prior to launch.
All right, Endeavour OTC, close and lock your visors and initiate O2 flow.
Endeavour copies, visors and suit O2.
As you can tell, launch is a pretty intense event. If you haven't been to see one, you're really missing out. People ask if you're nervous before going in. I actually felt like I was more nervous being an MCC as a Capcom or watching someone else that I knew inside the vehicle. You're so well trained before you go up and actually do the ascent that most of your time is spent just extremely focused, knowing what it is you're going to do every second of this 8.5-minute launch. The 2.5 minutes on the SRBs, as you could tell, is there's a lot of vibration, and you can see the shaking that goes on. As soon as they separate, it's a pretty smooth ride up into orbit. Our training team did a great job of telling us everything we need to know, and of course we tried to ignore that and look out the window as much as we could. 8.5 minutes later, 60% of your training is completely done, and now you got to figure out what you're going to do for the next 13 days.
As soon as the main engine's cut off, two of us get out of our seats. You see myself and Dave Williams shooting video and still photos of the ET photo for the teams to analyze on the ground. It's a beautiful shot and certainly something to distract you looking at the Earth. Flight day 2, we get busy surveying the port and starboard wing as well as the nose cap of the orbiter to assess any damages that may have occurred on ascent. On flight day 3, we begin our rendezvous with the space station and do a series of burns to bring ourselves closer and closer to that astonishing vehicle.
Yeah, this is a view from the International Space Station from Fyodor, Oleg, and Clay Anderson. That's actually a video camera. And here's the inside of the cockpit during part of the rendezvous. You can see how crowded it is here. We do this, what's called the rendezvous pitch maneuver. Most of it's actually done by the autopilot. It looks a lot more complicated than it really is. I'm not really flying the orbiter manually with a stick like you might think. It's more putting commands into the autopilot. But this is where we got the pictures of the little tile ding we had. Here's a picture of the shuttle as it approaches the International Space Station, and the sun is rising. And this is the part where I was actually flying the shuttle manually. I actually didn't dock this fast. Again, like the walkout was sped up for to make sure we weren't in here too long.
Do we have capture or not?
Not free capture.
Not
We have free drift.
in Houston and
Let's check those pedals out.
Flight controller power's off.
Once we're docked, it's time to open up the hatches and come aboard. And it's like any Hollywood gala event. Put out the red carpet and prepare for the paparazzi. At some point, I think there were more cameras than there were astronauts up there on board the space station. Here we are comparing all of our cameras to see who's got the nicer gear. Honestly, it was time just to go for a safety tour of the space station so we could start getting on to the next task at hand. It was good to see Clay after we trained with him all that time in Fyodor and Oleg.
Right after the safety brief, it's basically, hey, how you doing? No, how you doing? And then you're off to work. The EVA guys are prepping for going out of the door the next day, and they actually have to get all their suits over and get everything converted. And they're spending the night in a low-pressure environment so that they're ready to go out the next day. In the meantime, we are actually unberthing the S5 element, which is a small truss piece. And I think Scott's brother, Mark, was in Florida one time looking at it. He goes, hey, where is that element you're doing it? He was making fun of us because it was so small and his was a little bigger. But anyhow, S5 was taken from the shuttle arm to the station arm. And then in a coordinated event, we actually have to have it in position before EV crew members get out the door.
Yeah, once Charlie has the S5 element all lined up, Dave Williams and myself got there and GCA'd him in, and you could see the soft capture pin just going down into place. Once we soft captured S5 truss over to S4, we got out our PGTs, or basically our ratchet wrenches, if you will, and bolted the two pieces together. There's Dave and I up there. That was pretty much EVA 1. We did retract P6 also.
Meanwhile, inside, we had about 5,000 pounds of cargo to transfer onto the station, 4,000 pounds to bring back, and a lot of station repairs. There's Charlie Hobaugh Scorch out there putting a new cover on the window, and me taking some of the items across. Next, we have a setup for the next robotic operation, which is going to be our focused inspection, based on the fact that we saw that ding in the orbiter's belly. And this is handing off the boom so that we can do that with the shuttle's arm.
When the shuttle is docked to the station, you can't use the shuttle arm to grab the boom, so it is quite a dance. You use Scorch and Clay were over on the International Space Station side, grabbing the boom and then handing it off to Tracy with the shuttle arm. And this is the view of that ding that we had that the ground wanted to take a better look at.
Well, with our second spacewalk, the primary task was replacing the gyroscope that was failed on board the International Space Station. There was a lot of choreography involved in this. We started out coming out of the airlock. Rick went up to remove the covering, the MLI, over top of the failed CMG. And at the same time, I was configuring the robotic arm, putting the foot restraint on the end of the arm so that we could ride down to the payload bay and pick up the new gyroscope. But as we were going forward, we removed the old one, attached to what's called a mutt ball stack mutt, just a means of attaching the failed gyroscope to the space station itself. And you can see us moving over the failed gyroscope, getting ready to stick it on the mutt ball stack mutt. Once we got that in place, we had a chance to translate back down to the airlock. I climbed into the arm, and Scorch drove me down to the payload bay, but Rick actually translated down to the payload bay on the lab itself. Pretty spectacular view, as you can imagine, sitting on the end of the arm, looking out at the Earth going by beneath you at 25 times the speed of sound. But back to work once you get back in the payload bay, and here I am grabbing onto the CMG. Rick undid the bolt, and we're lifting this 1,200-pound structure away. It was a combination of the gyroscope and the mounting brackets that it was on as well. We had about 2 inches clearance as we were lifting this off the storage platform in the payload bay, and Scorch did an absolutely outstanding job driving the arm. And of course, I mentioned this to him, and he said, "What? I'm not driving the arm, it's driving itself." But looking down at the Earth was really incredible. You know, I had a face full of CMG riding on the end of the arm for most of this whole spacewalk. Once we got the CMG out of the bay, Rick came back to join me, and we installed the new CMG with all its support equipment on the external stowage platform number 2, right by the airlock. And then the choreography of this spacewalk was really quite complex. We then had to remove the new gyroscope from all of this support equipment, and then take the new gyroscope back up to Z1 at the work site, swap it out with the old failed gyroscope, and of course we did that robotically. Scorch again driving me up to the Z1 work site and bringing the gyroscope back in and getting that installed. Spectacular EVA, and it worked out really well.
So 2 of those assembly tasks were done with a combination of robotics and spacewalking. Another one of our assembly tasks was taking that stowage platform and putting it on the space station, and we did that totally robotically. So we took it out of the bay with the shuttle arm and handed it over to the station arm, and the station arm took it closer to the station, and then using computers, we sent commands to the latching to latch the ESP3 or the stowage platform onto the station. It's pretty interesting and a lot of fun flying the robotic arm. It's like geometry in action. It's great fun, and it's also quite challenging. When you are looking out the windows and making sure you're not running into anything, you're paying total attention to it.
One of the key features of our mission was the fact that it was the educator-astronaut thing, and before that was the Challenger mission, and we got a chance to talk with one of the Challenger centers while in orbit, Barb and I. It was special for us.
Okay. We also had some teachable moments, and we hope to be able to share those with students. The thing that we are most excited about education-wise on our mission is something that will grow and grow, and it's for students to do here on Earth with their teachers or with their scout leaders and other groups like that. We took up 10 million basil seeds with us, and they are returned now. We're getting them packaged up, ready to send out to classrooms all over the country. And we want our students to do what we get to do. Don't take a test. We won't give you a test on it, but we want you to experiment, explore, figure out what you want to know about these basil seeds, especially in terms of how we're going to feed people on the moon and Mars for long duration. And so we hope you'll be able to design some growth chambers for us.
And I was very happy those basil seeds didn't get loose.
Now, before we ever go out the hatch doing an EVA, there's plenty of work to be done beforehand, suiting up the guys and doing their pressure checks and making sure that they get buttoned up inside the crew lock securely. You see here a few of us doing some handshakes, getting tools on these guys and configured to go out the door. I think this is the beginning of EVA 3, and in that time frame we did a number of tasks, moving antennas as well as removing and replacing boxes such as baseband transponders and signal processors, as well as moving the CETA carts, which are work platforms that ride along the front face of our truss segment. We have 2 carts, and we had to relocate them from one side, I think the port side, to the starboard side, and that was in preparation for the upcoming missions that are going to be installing elements to the port side.
And like Tracy said, on EVA 3, one of the things we had to do was move the SASA gimbal. It was basically a communication antenna way up on the top of one truss, and we moved it to another truss. And that's in preparation to move that whole piece of truss. The second big task was this is Clay Anderson hanging onto a CETA cart, again, moving it to the other side of the space station in preparations for some future construction work. You can see there's Clay on the end of the arm. You can see it's a heck of a ride up there with some beautiful views. This is Clay's up-close helmet cam as he takes my picture as we circle around the world. And then we had a little bit of a snag on EVA 3. We had to cut it a little bit short because I had some hand-intensive EVAs, and over the time the glove got cut over in the thumb area. You could see it there. So once we came inside, Clay and Dave got some close-up shots of the glove, and we sent them down to Houston so they can analyze it a little closer.
At this point, we were trying to figure out how to maybe extend the flight to repair the small amount of damage we had in the bottom, but then Hurricane Dean popped up, and we had to figure out how we were going to cut the flight short. It was a impressive sight from the space station. Got some had some incredible passes over it, and then decided to do EVA 4.
EVA 4 was pretty exciting for us. We knew ahead of time that it was going to be a little bit shorter than normal. We were getting ready to close the hatch right after the EVA. I came out first and had a spectacular view of the world coming out at daytime, but we had a little bit of a challenge because in the airlock we had so much equipment that my hand control module for the SAFER actually deployed. So one of the first tasks of the EVA we hadn't really planned for was for Clay to put that back, and you'll see a close-up photo of that as Clay opens the door and gets that all folded up and brought it back inside and got it all set for me. Once we did that, we basically hit the ground running, and the first part of the spacewalk was to install some stanchions for the boom system that we're currently using for inspecting the orbiter. Clay and I translated or moved hand over hand up the CETA spur, and had these large pieces of equipment attached to us, and we installed those on the station, bolting them in place. Once we did that, we separated, and Clay went to retrieve the Missy experiments, and I was up working on the SASA, tightening up the gimbal locks, and once we had finished both of those two tasks, we again got together, kind of rendezvoused, picked up a fair amount of equipment, and translated out on the lab. Here you can see Clay bringing one of the Missies back in, and you can see how large it really is. He had to remove that and bring it back into the airlock. So we picked up extra tools at the airlock, translated out, and installed two antennas. They're called EWIS antennas that basically enable us to capture the images from our helmet cameras to see spectacular images like this of Hurricane Dean. And that pretty well finished up EVA-4. We had one other get-ahead task that we did, wire tying some cables back into place, got back in the airlock and closed the hatch, came back inside and got ready to close the hatch of between the vehicles.
As you can tell, all good things must come to an end, and there we actually closed the hatch the day before. We made sure we had everything on the right side of the hatch. In fact, we opened and closed them a couple times just to make sure we had everything. And up till we get to this moment in the following morning of actually separating away from station. Because we had to do an inspection afterwards, we didn't actually do a fly around where you actually circle the space station and take pictures of it and photograph it. We actually just separated out and did an early separation burn. And it was actually a pretty neat thing to do because we got to take some really great hands-off pictures of the station. It was actually a lot of fun in the windows where usually you'd be worried about making sure you're at the right distance and doing everything right. We're just separating out and kind of spiraling out and just having a good time watching it all happen. And in the meantime, we're getting ready for that late inspection. I actually got to do this event, even though I'm called the pilot. I'm really the co-pilot, and so Scott does the docking. I get to do the undocking, and then he does the landing. I had a lot of people ask me that told me the landing was great, and of course I just accepted that. But if they told me it was bad, I said, "Hey, it was Scott."
Here's views from inside the cockpit on entry day. We get again suited up very early for entry, several hours prior to landing. Here's a picture of us lining up on the runway. Most of the audio here is Scorch. Actually, being a very good co-pilot, talking me through the landing.
7, 6, 5, 400 feet. Gears on the way. Good energy through the threshold. You're on the ball bar. Good job. 5240, 4235.
At 40 feet, you can see us pick up a little bit of a drift here.
10220. Good left correction. Your touch.
We intentionally delayed the shoot for the crosswind landing test.
I told him to say that.
It's funny the things you read in the press about why the chute didn't come out. And here's us underneath the orbiter right after landing, taking a look at, among other things, the damage to the tile, and smiles on our faces.